Perfect. Perfect. Oh!
Thank you for your cooperation.
This is RoboCop. It has consistently been hailed by critics as a science fiction masterpiece in every sense of the word, and the titular character would cement himself as an icon of pop culture. Now, along with the 80s' string of masterful science fiction movies, the immense success of RoboCop would naturally lead to a plethora of merchandise, with the most prominent example in the context of this video being the 1988 video game adaptation. While most fondly remember the arcade version of the game, it's the Commodore 64 port that, unfortunately, wasn't nearly as praised. Why, you may ask? Because it's a game that was released in a deliberately unfinished state, and is impossible to complete by conventional means. See, the Commodore 64 version of the game specifically was made absurdly difficult, ostensibly for no good reason, but a further look indicates that the massive difficulty increase was deliberate. Upon reaching level 3, you'll notice that you're given an extremely stringent amount of time to complete the level, and no matter how pixel perfect your efforts are, you'll never make it past this stage. That being said, there is a way to bypass this by executing a wall glitch that allows you to skip the level in its entirety, but upon reaching the 4th level, you're met with a jumbled mess of pixels and sprites, which renders it unbeatable. This is because the rest of the game wasn't finished by the time the developers reached their deadline, so instead of extending development time to fix the issue, or scrapping the port altogether, they decided to crank up the game's difficulty, and pray that any unsuspecting player didn't stumble across this mishap. This is what I'm talking about today, games that, for one reason or another, are impossible to 100% complete. Enjoy! Alright, so let's kick things off by talking about one of the most influential and groundbreaking arcade games of all time, 1981's Donkey Kong. It helped establish Nintendo as one of the heavy hitters of the video game market, and also laid the foundation for plenty of their subsequent titles. I mean, I've seen more than a few people view Donkey Kong as one of the earliest examples of a platformer. Well, that is if you can excuse poor Mario's feeble legs. Oh, I'm sorry, Jumpman. The guy can't jump on a platform more than 3 feet below him, or his arthritis kicks in and reminds him as to why he's a plumber and not an Olympic long jumper. Dude wouldn't last 10 minutes in an Assassin's Creed game, but that's not saying much because neither could Ezio's family. In other words, Donkey Kong is a game that helped catapult gaming's popularity to a widespread scale. And I'd argue that without its success, the gaming industry wouldn't be nearly as prominent as it is today. Now, that being said, Donkey Kong is still an arcade game through and through. And if you know anything about arcade games, you should know that they are deliberately designed to be simple to pick up and play, but excruciatingly difficult to master. See, back in the day, developers would intentionally design arcade games in a way that would give players the compulsion to fork up more coins in order to get an extra life, and by extension, an extra attempt at playing the game. Now, Donkey Kong is not an exception to this, because to this day, there are no official means of fully completing the game, both due to a glitch and due to the developers simply not expecting players to reach the finish line. See, in the original arcade version of the game, if you were to miraculously reach stage 22, which for context is the 117th screen, you would encounter an infamous bug known as the kill screen. Under traditional circumstances, you're given a somewhat reasonable window of time to successfully complete the level, but on stage 22 in particular, you're bestowed with a ludicrously minuscule amount of time, 4 seconds to be specific, meaning that no matter what you do, it's impossible to pass the level. Well, to an extent. Recently, and I do mean very recently, about half a year ago, a Donkey Kong speedrunner uncovered a truly groundbreaking technique that took the speedrunning scene by storm.
This is insane. There's no way. What?
But there are 2 caveats to this. Number 1, this was only achieved via a tool-assisted speedrun as opposed to actual hardware. While it is theoretically possible for someone to achieve this on a regular Donkey Kong arcade cabinet, the amount of frame-perfect inputs you'd have to successfully press is absolutely mind-boggling at making it close to impossible. And number 2, believe it or not, it's actually reliant on RNG to an extent. And while I'm not fully knowledgeable on the minutia of the odds, I do know that you have a roughly 1 out of 96 odds of hitting this thing perfectly. However, emulation also opened up the floodgates to the numerous possibilities present in the game, as players were able to reach the game's true final stage, that being the aptly named Stage 99, which, trust me, is no easy feat. Meanwhile, here I am struggling with the Donkey Kong arcade cabinet in Donkey Kong 64, and that's only 4 screens it's asking me to beat. Give me a camera and demand that I take pictures of fairies that dart around the room like a washed-up rock star in a crack house, no problem. Ask me to soar through rings with jetpack controls that are harder than me after seeing Candy Kong, that is A-okay. But give me a couple of rolling barrels and a few conveyor belts, and suddenly I become the human equivalent of a ceiling fan. However, even if you make it to Stage 99, don't expect an elaborate hidden message or a pixelized celebratory trophy, because if you do manage to overcome this stage, guess what? You're stuck in a perpetual loop of playing Stage 99 over and over again until you eventually die. Isn't that fucking depressing?
Did I ever tell you the definition of insanity?
This is because the developers weren't able to add a stage 100 due to the loop counter only capable of displaying 2 digits. Of course, Donkey Kong is one of many arcade games that are technically impossible to beat, as Pac-Man, for example, has that infamous level 256 kill screen in which the screen becomes a garbled mess of confusion and abstract art due to an integer overflow. But for me, Donkey Kong takes the cake as one of the most peculiar examples, because even after bypassing a previously thought to be impossible roadblock, beating the game is still unachievable to this very day. But then there's Donkey Kong 64, or the more recently released Donkey Kong Bonanza, which I hear phenomenal things about, but a Switch 2 is a little out of my budget at the moment. Those games aren't impossible, but when you look at the absurd amount of collectibles that you'll need in order to complete them, well, it certainly feels like it, especially if you're one golden banana short of 100%, and your last objective is completing a hectic match of Beaver Bother. Yeah, no, I'll pass. Are you fucking kidding me? Alright, so next up we're talking about a Mortal Kombat game, but it's not quite what you would initially expect at first. I'm talking about Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks. This game takes a departure from the series' fighting game roots, and instead opts to embrace a hack-and-slash or beat-em-up approach to its gameplay. You gotta understand that this was released during the PlayStation 2 and Xbox era of consoles, which were flooded with heaps of hack-and-slash titles after games like God of War and Devil May Cry jump-kicked onto the scene. However, Shaolin Monks is, in my opinion at least, a genuinely excellent and kick-ass experience from start to finish. It's packed to the brim with copious amounts of fan service, and offers a seamless blend of unique ideas and the tried-and-true hallmarks of a traditional Mortal Kombat experience. One of my favorite aspects of this game is its immense assortment of Easter eggs and hidden secrets, which, if you ask me, falls in line with the series phenomenally. It might not have been the first series to introduce Easter eggs and hidden secrets, but it certainly popularized the idea on a widespread scale. You'll find Mortal Kombat characters that either take you on in battle or leave you with some highly practical goodies and rewards as compensation, as well as a plethora of unlockables for you to mess around with later on. However, there's one secret that this game harbors that, aptly enough, took fans a little while to discover after the game was released, and is the focal point of this section of the video. Towards the end of the game's story mode, you'll find yourself in an area known as the Foundry, which serves as your final respite before taking on 3, yeah, count them, 3 bosses back to back: Shang Tsung, Kintaro, and the ominous and ruthlessly difficult, the formidable Shao Kahn. At this point, most players get their asses handed to them, and leave Liu Kang over here looking more slack-jawed than me after watching that one scene in Basic Instinct. You know the one where every guy in his early 20s would pause and have one hand on the remote and the other on his Basic Instinct DVD case. However, if you take a different route and perform an elaborate series of steps, you'll eventually uncover a hidden portal that leads directly into a secret area that many fans refer to as Survival Mode. And yes, if you're wondering, this is the only way to access it. Survival Mode is, in essence, the game's closest equivalent to a boss rush mode, and it sees you taking on gradually more difficult enemies and bosses that you've encountered throughout the game. It's certainly not for the faint of heart either, as you'll often see yourself fighting multiple bosses all at once and enduring arduous waves of enemies. However, if you want to tick that completion meter to 100%, it's required that you complete the secret mode in its entirety. At least, that's how it works on the PlayStation 2 version. The Xbox version specifically, however, wasn't so fortunate. See, normally, you'd fight 9 rounds of enemies and bosses, with the area changing in between rounds. And on the PlayStation 2, this worked damn near flawlessly. However, the Xbox version inexplicably crashes on round 3, meaning that it's quite literally impossible to make it to the next round, and by extension, complete the game 100%. It doesn't matter what you do, you can try extending extensively cleaning your disc, dispatching enemies in a specific order, or trying on co-op mode instead of single player, but regardless of what you do, you'll never make it past round 3 on the Xbox version. Now, as to why this is the case, nobody truly knows, but I did find something very intriguing on the cutting room floor, a website that's dedicated to documenting scrapped content that can still be found within the game's files. According to the cutting room floor, survival mode was initially accessible through more conventional means, as there were plans to include it on the game's title screen. However, survival mode wasn't complete during this build of the game, so the option to select it through the title screen was removed and never altered before the final release. What does this mean? Well, there's a moderate likelihood that survival mode was never meant to be in the final release due to its unfinished state, but the developers forgot to remove the secret method of accessing the mode out of the game and also neglected to remove its ability to impact the completion percentage. This means that no matter how many times you try, you will never reach 100% completion on the Xbox version of the game specifically. Players were understandably upset over this, with some calling it a serious issue in an otherwise surprisingly impressive spin-off, but me personally, I'd consider this a fatal flaw. Yeah, pun 100% intended, sue me. Alright, so let's kick into the segment where, once in a blue moon, I talk about a decades-old point-and-click adventure game, because we're talking about Simon the Sorcerer 3D. I've never played a Simon the Sorcerer game, and judging by how this one looks, I wouldn't want to be in the same room with it unless Chris Hansen was hiding in a nearby storage closet.
How you doing? Alright, how are you? Have a seat over that chair.
Now, Simon the Sorcerer 3D is often regarded as the low point of the Simon the Sorcerer series, and as to why this is, I'm not entirely certain, but I can at least both praise and ridicule this game for its surprisingly clever final puzzle. If you've ever played a pre-Telltale Walking Dead era point-and-click adventure game, you would know that the most challenging aspect is not the stress-induced spur-of-the-moment decision that can potentially alter the course of the game's story, but instead the myriad of arduous puzzles that often require some oddball levels of thinking in order to progress. There's the infamous goat puzzle in Broken Sword, The Shadow of the Templars, the Petrified Forest, or the Bedding Stub from Grim Fandango, and even the laughably illogical cat hair mustache puzzle from Gabriel Knight 3, Blood of the Sacred, Blood of the Damned. Solving these types of puzzles is akin to being tasked with digging up treasure from underneath concrete with nothing but a toy dinosaur, a stick of gum, and an unused box of condoms that'll remain unopened because you're a deadbeat virgin. However, most of these point-and-click adventure games will, at the very least, require you to solve them by actually playing the game, whether it be through subtle dialogue cues, using your surroundings, or simply tapping into the more creative side of your brain. However, Simon the Sorcerer 3D took things a step further. In the final puzzle, Simon finds himself inside of a Matrix-esque environment known as the Nexus. After a series of puzzling and frankly absurd ordeals, you'll reach the game's final puzzle, which sees you, with nothing but a disc in your inventory, attempting to open a computer that lacks both a keyboard and an eject button for the disk drive. Because apparently this thing was manufactured by a sadist or one of the higher-ups at EA. All you wanted to do was play a game on your $3,000 gaming PC, but now you gotta fork over a liver and your firstborn child in order to afford the rest. But at least you get to play Skyrim at max settings, fully loaded with mods, right? Right? Wait, it's vanilla Skyrim? Damn it, that's it. C-Sim, send him to the fucking tar pits. Now, without an eject button, what are you supposed to do? Well, in a clever twist, you're actually supposed to click the eject button on your real-life PC's disk drive. It's a bit unorthodox, but it's still considered the highlight of an otherwise underwhelming experience. Now, I know what you're thinking, what's the problem? Well, you see, this particular solution was coded in a way that wasn't applied universally. Whenever the game expects you to open up your disk drive, it searches for a particular signal that indicates whether or not your disk drive is open. It's actually a fairly clever way of integrating this third wall breaking puzzle, but the problem is that this particular disk drive signal wasn't present in all computers even at the time of the game's release. This means that there were probably more than a few instances where a player got stumped on the last level, asked a friend or looked at an official guide, and end up feeling duped as they stare at their computer screen with a puzzled expression like they're trying to listen to dialogue in a Christopher Nolan movie. What's even more humorous is that this particular oversight was never addressed, even in the digital releases of the game, such as the Steam versions, for example. And if you know anything about modern computers, finding one with a disk drive already installed is like finding a Slayer song without a guitar solo that sounds like a horse's reaction to getting neutered. There is somewhat of a way to counteract this, as I've seen posts that claim that you can install a digital disk drive and unmount it, but in terms of an official way of completing the game without installing something, or using a specific disk drive, yeah, no. But unlike that occasionally faulty disk drive puzzle, I've got something for you guys that works regardless of which computer system you're using. I'm talking about Surfshark VPN, the sponsor of this video. Imagine, if you will, you're a young, doe-eyed connoisseur of the internet, happily clacking along your keyboard and checking out your favorite YouTuber, completely oblivious to the fact that every single strand of information that you provide is at risk of being stolen, shared, or sold to other companies without your consent. Well, that's where Surfshark VPN comes into play. Virtual private networks are a necessity in the contemporary era of the internet, and what better service to choose than Surfshark VPN? If you're worried about your password to your Crunchyroll account getting leaked, don't worry. Surfshark's there to protect and encrypt your data so that nobody lays a finger on your countless hours of binge-watching Naruto and wishing that you had the physique and combat prowess of Sasuke. I'm not projecting, I'm just providing a specific example, okay? But it's not just that, because Surfshark VPN also allows you to discover content that would otherwise be censored in your region. See, this hits close to home for me. I like my internet searching like I like my music. Uncensored, because I hate listening to a song only for the explicit synonym of the term used for fecal matter being replaced by an abhorrently mixed sound of a record scratch. Just boot up Surfshark VPN, select a different region, and just like that, you've gained an infinite supply of knowledge that you probably weren't even aware of until now. And just in case you weren't convinced, Surfshark also comes equipped with an antivirus tool, so you won't have to lose sleep over whether or not that Play GTA 5 for free link was a generous offer from Rockstar or an attempt at Trojan horsing your software. Surfshark also offers up a 30-day money-back guarantee if you're miraculously not satisfied with the service. And as the cherry on top of the sundae, if you click this link, which I'll also be providing in the description below, you can get Surfshark with an added bonus of 4 extra months of use at no additional cost. Alternatively, you can also type the code CSHIFT at the checkout screen. Once again, that's CSHIFT at the checkout screen for 4 additional months at no cost. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring the video, and without further ado, let's get right back to it. Alright, so we're going to be taking a look at a more modern entry, that being 2012's Hitman Absolution. So, Hitman Absolution was an interesting point in the Hitman series' history, because it's easily the most polarizing entry to date. Some people appreciated the game's more linear and narratively focused structure, while others lamented that the series had lost its identity, with the aforementioned linearity and significantly streamlined level design hindering what could have been the best game in the series from a gameplay and presentation standpoint. Personally, I enjoy this game. It's far from the best entry, but I can appreciate how the game provided you with a more snappy and fast-paced approach to the series as opposed to the more methodical and slow-paced feeling of the other games. Now, that being said, there was one aspect of the game that was universally praised by fans and critics alike, that being the series' first attempt at a pseudo-multiplayer mode, Contracts. Contracts mode is simple. You select a level, pick up to a handful of targets for you to dispatch of, do the deed, and no, I'm not talking about coitus, but don't worry, you'll end up seeing an axe wound either way, and then exit the level before proudly challenging your friends to eliminate those same targets. It's a really unique mode, and it's one of the very few ideas that carried over to the Hitman World of Assassination trilogy, albeit with a few tweaks and modifications. So why do I bring this all up? Well, Contracts mode, ironically enough, would end up rendering this game as technically impossible to fully complete. See, in May of 2018, it was announced that the servers for Absolution's Contracts mode would be temporarily shut down later that month due to 2 factors. One, the Contracts mode had to adhere to the European GDPR guidelines that were going into effect that month, and 2, IO Interactive, the developers of the game, had apparently lost ownership of the game's servers. IO Interactive had promised fans that the shutdown wasn't going to be permanent, but it's been 7 years since this original announcement was made, and I'll give you 3 guesses as to what happened next. Time's up, by the way. They said they were gonna get cigarettes, took a one-way flight to Paris, and left poor Absolution to suffer as the bastard son of the Hitman family. I'd call it the redheaded stepchild, but it couldn't even manage to earn that title because there's a fucking bald guy on the cover. That's right, the servers for Contracts mode were never restored, and if you're wondering, no, you can't access this mode offline either. You have to connect to the servers in order to access it. This means that Hitman Absolution is now impossible to be fully completed, because the now defunct Contracts mode actually contributes to that percentage. And just to add insult to injury, if you've ever played this game post-May of 2018 and wondered why you couldn't do anything with the numerous weapons and costumes you unlocked throughout the game, it's because Contracts mode was the only means of being able to prepare and set up your gear loadout prior to a mission. So that means that you're not just missing out on completing the game in its entirety, but you're also unable to play the only mode that lets you achieve the full Hitman experience, customizable loadouts and all. Granted, there have been a few attempts at restoring Absolution servers, but they're restricted to the PC version exclusively, and the steps are about as easy to follow as it is to follow me roughly an hour after I chug a bottle of prune juice. Yeah, I shit myself, sue me. You call it disgusting, I call it self-defense. However, there is a silver lining to this story, as fans have created servers for the Hitman World of Assassination trilogy that are exclusively designed to be fully played offline. This not only serves as a means of earning XP and experience without an internet connection or while experiencing a server outage, but also preemptively preserves the trilogy's full functionality in the prospect of a sudden server shutdown. It's only available on PC as of right now, but it's still a commendable start. Alright, so let's talk about a game that I define as a shit show as early as its conception, the ambitious yet wildly unpolished Action 52. If you've never heard of Action 52, it was, in essence, the end result of a minuscule, first-time game development crew tackling an unrealistically ambitious title at the behest of a clueless businessman who had absolutely no knowledge about the industry that he was trying to barge into. It is the physical manifestation of the term quantity over quality. And no, that is not a positive term, as it's essentially a massive collection of 52 different titles packaged into one cartridge at the eye-watering price tag of roughly $200, which translates to a staggering $460 in today's economy. And what did you get if you were able to muster up nearly $500 if we're accounting for inflation? A bland, uninspired, boilerplate hodgepodge of titles that could be charitably described as dollar store renditions of, at the time, popular titles. Needless to say, Action 52 was a flop both critically and commercially, and contrary to the developer team and the boneheaded businessman that greenlit this project, the Cheetah Men were not going to have nearly as much staying power as the likes of Mario or Sonic the Hedgehog. Hell, even Bubsy was tap dancing on the Cheetah Men's respective graves, and probably spouted another one of his shitty one-liners like the societal nuisance he is.
Now, what would a platform game be without platforms?
But that did not stop the team from incentivizing consumers to purchase this wildly expensive title. See, when the game first released, the team over at Active Enterprises announced a competition that would coincide with Action 52's launch. The competition would award a hefty $104,000 to anyone who could manage to beat level 5 of Ooze, one of the handful of big-ticket games in the collection. And when I say big ticket, I mean it's one of the only 5 games in the collection that grants the player a proper ending upon completion. Yes, you heard me, only 5 of the 52 games have an actual functioning end screen. That's how fucking low the bar has been set. If it could go down any lower, you'd know exactly what its uvula feels like without using your hands, you sick bastard. Now, while I did mention that Ooze was one of a mere handful of games that actually had a proper end screen, a majority of players never got to experience it, because Ooze is, ironically enough, impossible to beat on official hardware. After completing the second level of Ooze, the game inexplicably crashes, meaning that you're unable to reach level 5, and by extension, claim the $104,000 prize. Now, at first, this might have seemed like a sleazy business tactic made to drive sales figures, but the glitch was actually rectified in Revision B of the game, which allowed you to complete Ooze in its entirety, but by the time that version of the game was released, the contest had already been cancelled, meaning that any attempt to collect the prize would be rendered fruitless. Oh, and just to add insult to injury, there are actually 6 levels in Ooze as opposed to the advertised 5. Oh, and that personalized code provided to you at the end screen that you could send to the developers to collect the prize was actually the same on each cartridge regardless of which one you had. There is another game in this collection called Atmos Quake that is also impossible to complete, but this time it's due to a glitch that alters the design of the 5th level of the game, and if you couldn't guess, any chance of making it past the 5th level is impossible. And as the cherry on top of this sundae comprised of fecal matter and poor choices, when the game first released, there were actually 2 games that were impossible to complete because you couldn't even start them in the first place, those being Alfredo and Jigsaw. Upon selecting either one of these games, the game would immediately crash, meaning that this game should have been called 50 games, but you'll get 52 on days that end in Z. There's no workaround to this, and to this day, you either have to emulate the game or have a Revision B cartridge in order to get a chance to play them. But why you would go out of your way to do that is beyond me. I mean, this game already gives me 50 reasons to want to chug cyanide through a bendy straw. Give me 52 and we'll probably have another one of those melodramatic Netflix shows. To this day, Action 52 is largely viewed as a bug-riddled laughingstock in gaming's rich history, but it unfortunately hasn't prevented future companies from releasing poorly optimized, glitch-infested tech demos with a $70 price tag slapped on them. But look, at least it's not Action 52 levels of broken. Alright, so for this last entry, we're taking a look at a simple game port gone awry with a particular release of the game Last Ninja 3. So when it comes to the greatest ninja games of all time, what do you think of? You might think of the Mortal Kombat series with its colorful array of ninjas to choose from, and that sudden oh shit factor when you see a guy getting burned alive out of the blue. Or you might think of Mini Ninjas, one of the most criminally underrated titles out there. So much so that I've been begging for a sequel since I finished the damn game back when it first released. But another solid pick would probably be Last Ninja 3, a game that I had no no idea even existed until I started researching this video. So Last Ninja 3 was the third, and as of right now, final entry in the extremely well-received Last Ninja trilogy. Hell, this alone could arguably be described as a critically acclaimed title just by looking at these review scores. And I've seen some refer to this as one of the Commodore 64's finest titles. It's an action-adventure game that follows a gameplay style relatively similar to something like the early Legend of Zelda titles, with its heavy emphasis on combat, puzzles, and exploration. Sure, while some would argue that it hasn't aged particularly well, it's often regarded as a classic by most people. Now you're probably wondering where the impossible angle comes from, because for a game with this much consistent praise, you'd think that the game would have far more critical reviews. But in order to get there, we have to talk about a little game console that you may or may not have heard of. We're talking about the Nintendo Wii. The Wii needs no introduction. It has a vast library of acclaimed titles, it helped popularize motion controls on a widespread scale, and was somehow capable of beating out both the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 with a controller that looks like either the world's most inefficient TV remote or a vibrator crafted by a fidget toy designer. Now, the Wii has a feature that you may or may not be familiar with, that being the Wii Shop channel. Long before Nintendo implemented the Nintendo eShop, this was their first foray into a digital storefront, not too dissimilar to Xbox Live or PlayStation Network. Now, while it has sadly been defunct for years, for a while you could actually purchase retro titles sold under the Wii Virtual Console brand. See, back when I had a Wii, I installed both Donkey Kong and Galaga on it using this particular service before it was left to collect dust in my grandma's storage unit because I thought she would enjoy using it. Big mistake. I love you, Mimi, but I'm taking back custody of the Wii, goddammit. I've missed my kids. Now, for roughly 2 years, or less than a year depending on what region you were in, one of the many titles that you could purchase from the Wii Shop channel was, you guessed it, Last Ninja 3. And I'd imagine that fans were actually quite excited for this, because aside from a port on the Amiga CD32 that released 2 years after the game's initial launch, this was the only other legitimate means of playing the game on official hardware. To put that into perspective, it took nearly 2 decades to get this game back on a console. Yeah, and developers wonder why people resort to emulation to satiate their gaming fix. Now, for whatever reason, if you were to officially buy this game through the Wii Shop channel, you'd be bestowed with a severely tarnished and blatantly untested version of the game. Why? Well, simple. You couldn't even make it past the first level. Upon attempting to complete the first level, the game would inexplicably crash, and that's it. There's no means of avoiding it, no way of counteracting the effects, no circumventions or workarounds, absolutely nothing. You were stuck with a vastly inferior port of the game that, shockingly, didn't result in refunds until 2 years after its appearance on the storefront. See, the North American version released in 2008, while the European version released in 2010. Despite 2 years worth of time to squash bugs or clean up the code in order to prevent the crash from occurring, this exact same issue was present on the European version. After this occurred, the report received heaps of backlash, and understandably so. You're paying for a video game that can't even make it past the first level without shitting itself and imploding. So what did the developers do? Well, instead of doing the logical thing, like, I don't know, fixing the game and providing a patch that rectified the error, they delisted the game from the storefront, refunded the riled up customers, and scampered off into the sunset. All they had to do was fix the game, roll out an update, which, yes, even in its more primitive form, was still possible on the Wii. Everyone would benefit, and they'd probably be giving each other pats on the back, blue ribbons, maybe even a few greasy handjobs as a Christmas bonus, I don't know. But no, they removed it, buried it 6 feet underground, and to this day, there hasn't been another port of Last Ninja 3 since then. What a damn shame. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll be partaking in a little bit of a hidden gem search, because I want to satiate my Earthbound fix, but I've already beaten the game a few times, and I've been at the receiving end of Ness's Cytobe so many times that seeing his sprite alone leads to violent heart palpitations and a compulsion to commit voluntary manslaughter. So unless you want my first face reveal to be on a news segment, it's probably best that I find something else to play. Oh, what's this? Heartbound. Huh, this looks right up my alley. Oh, negative reviews. Pfft, it's probably a little bit too niche. Oh, and would you look at that? There's a video about the developer. Oh, well, I betcha he just doesn't take criticism all that well because of how superlative his game is. Let's take a look.
Then, in December 2018, the game comes out, and there's only 2 chapters out of 5. The 3rd chapter remains incomplete to this day, and monthly updates consist of minor bug fixes and irrelevant additions that don't get the game anywhere near completion.
Oh, I betcha this guy worked at Blizzard, didn't he? See, Sim, you know what to do. Put him in the fucking grease pit.